And now, aviation weather around Alaska. Hello, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan, bringing you your Alaska aviation weather outlook as we head into the weekend. Don't forget the time change is coming up Saturday night before you go to bed, or when you wake up there Sunday morning. We fall back 1 hour to standard time. Well, of note, we've had a volcano quite active with ongoing eruptions out through the Kamchatka Peninsula. Name of the volcano is Klyuchevsko. And this ash plume that has been ongoing this past week, drifting off toward the east-southeast. It's still impacting areas south of the eastern Aleutians and south of the tip of the Alaska Peninsula as of this Friday, November 3rd. This particular volcanic ash advisory is in effect until quarter to 4 p.m. Alaska Daylight Time this Friday afternoon, so more updates will be following. But we find that there is ash and some sulfur dioxide there as high as 36,000 feet, and because of the location of where this ash plume is drifting off to the east-southeast at about 10 knots into the North Pacific, the Washington Volcanic Ash Observatory will be keeping tabs on this in the next statement that'll come up. But just be aware of that fact. And looking at what we have coming up this weekend, rather brisk east-northeast flow across the interior as well as areas of the north, including along the North Slope and Brooks Range. We're going to be watching a weather system bring moisture up through Cook Inlet, maybe even some snow into Anchorage by Sunday. Another low coming in up off of Haida Gwaii and staying just off of the Panhandle coast for the later weekend. And then another frontal system and low way out in the western Bering here as we get into Sunday. So in the meantime, we still have a fair amount of moisture and IFR conditions along and south of the Alaska Range through the Copper River Basin, Prince William Sound, northern western Gulf, Cook Inlet down through Shelikof Strait, northern part of the Alaska Peninsula. Also IFR up along areas of the Arctic coast centered on Utqiagvik and down into the central North Slope. Also IFR conditions early Saturday morning, north end of the Panhandle, especially up around Chilkoot and White Passes, then way out in the far western Aleutians. By Saturday afternoon, we see an area of IFR conditions around Cook Inlet, the Kenai Peninsula, extending up across the west arm of the Alaska Range up into the interior toward McGrath. Area of snow expanding northward. We also have IFR conditions along the northwest Arctic coast, especially from just east Cape Lisburne on up to around Wainwright and up to Utqiagvik, and then with the next frontal system out here in through the lower Bering and the Aleutian chain up pushing into the central Aleutians. Sunday morning, we still have this pocket of IFR along areas of the western Alaska Range in through the lower middle Yukon Valley, east side of Norton Sound. And again, brisk northeast to east winds continuing here through the weekend. MVFR conditions across most of the Panhandle, some VFR, especially along the Alcan border, Yukon Flats, and then IFR conditions into the central Bering, dipping down toward the central eastern Aleutians. And for Sunday afternoon, we expect IFR conditions along the far inner coastal mountains or channels there of the Panhandle. Areas again lingering along perhaps the west arm of the Alaska Range on up toward the middle Yukon and up toward Kotzebue Sound, and also out over just southwest of St. Matthew, and then down and along just north of the eastern and central Aleutians. Pass conditions, Anaktuvik Pass MVFR expected on Saturday. With some breezy conditions. Atigun Pass also MVFR conditions. Further south and west, Lake Clark and Merrill, west arm of the Alaska Range, IFR will have low ceilings, precipitation mainly in the form of some snow, icing potential there as well. Rainy Pass IFR conditions as well during the day on Saturday as we round up Central Alaska Range, Windy Pass IFR. Further east, Isabel Pass starts out IFR becoming MVFR. And then along the Alcan border there, Mentasta Pass, IFR becoming MVFR as well. Dropping down across the Copper River Basin, we do expect IFR conditions there in the morning. Tanita Pass, IFR becoming MVFR. Portage Pass should generally hold on to IFR conditions throughout the day on Saturday. And further to the east, up on there in the north end of the Panhandle, Chilkoot and White are looking at IFR conditions giving way to MVFR conditions by Saturday afternoon. Freezing levels at the surface run along the Russian coast to just south of St. Lawrence, and then down along the southwest coast, bumping upwards in through the Susitna Valley, and then eastward along the interior of the Gulf Coast to British Columbia. Freezing levels are highest southeast there of the Panhandle up toward the tip of Haida Gwaii, upwards of 8,000 feet, 6,000 foot freezing levels nudging up in the far southern Panhandle up around Ketchikan and Craig. And then they do come up to, or I should say, about 4,000 feet along the northern Gulf Coast and along the coastline there, the Kenai, down through Kodiak Island. Little slightly milder air trying to push in to the far western Aleutians with the next low in front that'll be working its way eastward through that area during the course of the weekend. So the greatest threat of icing on Saturday will be associated, one, with the low that's going to be kind of pivoting up out just off of Haida Gwaii and the Panhandle as we go through the weekend, but fairly high, above 8,000 feet. Here across areas of the interior, the western central Alaska Range on up into the middle Yukon Valley, including McGrath, generally around and above 4,000 feet. We're going to have areas of snow here, perhaps some mixed precipitation in parts of the Susitna Valley or here in Cook Inlet. And then further west, we find an area with a frontal band out here and through the lower central bearing of the western Aleutians, generally above 6,000 feet. Jet stream winds, we have winds from the southwest along the western Gulf, upwards of 65 knots. On the backside of this, we see winds out of the north across the eastern bearing as high as 65 to 85 knots, and then a belt of winds far western bearing in excess of 100 knots, bringing it down to 700 millibars. Here's a low circulation centered southwest of Haida Gwaii with strongest winds coming onshore around Vancouver Island into British Columbia, 50 to 65 knots from the southwest. And then back here out toward the eastern Bering Strait, we find winds that initially are easterly. We have some rather brisk winds that'll be turning northward across the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutians at anywhere from 35 to 50 knots and a broader belt of 50 to 70 knot winds in the mid-levels at 700 millibars there near and just north of the western Aleutians. And then finally, at 3,000 feet, you see the low circulation just southwest of Haida Gwaii. Strongest winds with that in the lower levels of the atmosphere, 50 to 55 knots down there in the North Pacific off of Vancouver and British Columbia. Here across the northern parts of the state, brisk 30, 40 knot winds along the north slope, Arctic coast, also areas of the interior just along and north of the Yukon River, and then winds turn northerly down across the southwest coast through the southeast portion of the Bering Sea and across the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians, 35 to 40 knots, and then a belt of 40, 45 knot winds along the central and western Aleutians. This translates to a fair amount of turbulence. Considerable moderate turbulence is possible along areas of the North Slope, western Brooks Range, along the Yukon River, south of the Brooks Range and between the Alaska Range surface to 6,000 feet. And then another area of turbulence with the northerly flow coming across the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians surface to 4,000 feet. Pretty good bed of some moderate turbulence there. And then out toward the central western Aleutians, we see a wide swath of turbulence, the surface there to 4,000 feet.